Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right. So you ever get the feeling like history is kind of like, how on earth did we end up here?
Oh, absolutely.
Like one thing leads to another and boom,
Yeah.
totally different world. Well, today's deep dive is all about exactly that. How did Europe go from everyone united against fascism to like staring each other down across the Iron Curtain
Right.
just a few years after World War II? It's wild. We're going deep into your stack of sources on this one, and let me tell you, it gets way more complicated than just good guys and bad guys.
Yeah, it's fascinating how quickly things unraveled after the war. We're talking a complete redrawing of the map.
Yeah.
Politically, economically, even militarily. Everything's up for grabs.
It's 1945. The Allies have won. Hard-fought victory, but it's almost like immediately there are these cracks, right? Like, weren't the Yalta and Potsdam Conferences supposed to be all about avoiding another war, about like hashing out this peaceful future?
Well, on paper, yeah, the goal was cooperation. But Yalta and Potsdam, they really highlight how, even with good intentions, like agreements between countries, they can be vague, open to interpretation. And then, yeah, disagreements are bound to happen.
It's like trying to like build a house when everyone's brought their own blueprints and they all think theirs is the best one.
Exactly. And you have to remember, the wartime alliance, it was always a little bit, we're friends until this is over kind of deal.
Yeah.
I mean, historian John Lewis Gaddis even called it a marriage of convenience. So Hitler's out of the picture, and suddenly those differences, those tensions, they were already simmering under the surface, they start bubbling up.
Yeah, and nowhere is that more obvious than in Eastern Europe. It's like, well, while everyone else is celebrating, Stalin's busy. Well, what exactly is he doing?
He's setting the stage for, well, it's all about consolidating his power. See, by the war's end, Soviet troops, they're stationed all across Eastern Europe. And while free elections, they were promised at Yalta, Stalin had something a little different in mind. He used, get this, he used what Hungarian communist leader Matyas Rákosi called salami tactics.
Salami tactics. Okay, now I need to hear more about this. I love a good visual.
So picture a salami, right? Slice by slice, it disappears, yeah. Well, that was Stalin's game plan. He'd remove his political opponents little by little, install pro-Soviet governments, and do it slowly, gradually, so that almost without anyone realizing, boom, Eastern Europe's under his control.
So less of a hostile takeover, more like a slow and steady squeeze?
Precisely. And this is where the historical debate gets really juicy. Some historians see this as part of this grand plan of Stalin's, a way to expand his empire while pretending to just be creating a buffer zone for security, right? But then others, they argue that Stalin, he was deeply affected, traumatized even by the Nazi invasion, right? And he was terrified of the West, genuinely threatened, so he acted defensively. At least that's how they see it.
So either a power-hungry dictator or a leader so driven by fear that he ends up creating the very enemy he's afraid of in the first place. It's amazing how history can be interpreted in such different ways. But regardless of what was going on in Stalin's head, I mean, the outcome was pretty clear. Eastern Europe, it's becoming more and more isolated, hidden behind, as Churchill so famously put it.
The Iron Curtain.
Right. And that speech, 1946, that's a turning point. It's like suddenly this division, it's not just implied anymore, it's right there out in the open. But it wasn't just about politics and ideology, was it? We had whole economies splitting down the middle, too.
You're right. It went way deeper than that. And that's where we've got to talk about the Marshall Plan coming in.
Ah, yes, the Marshall Plan, the one where the U.S. pumps billions into rebuilding Europe. But it wasn't just like a giant act of charity, right? I mean, there had to be something in it for them.
Well, officially, and I'm quoting Secretary of State George Marshall directly here, the goal was to fight against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos.
Right.
The thinking being a stable economy is less likely to, be tempted by communism.
So it's kind of like, hey, we'll help you out, but we're going to do it our way.
Some historians definitely see it that way. They'd argue that the Marshall Plan was just as much about spreading U.S. influence, about creating new markets, as it was about actual humanitarian aid. It's a debate that still goes on today. Was it genuine generosity, or was it a strategic power play disguised as goodwill?
It really makes you think twice about, foreign aid programs. Even now, what are the motivations behind those? But regardless, I mean, the Marshall Plan, it only made that East-West divide even bigger.
Oh, absolutely. Stalin saw it as a direct threat. I mean, he banned Eastern European nations from taking any Marshall Plan aid. Instead, he created Comecon, his own separate economic bloc, specifically designed to, tie those countries to the Soviet Union and their sphere of influence.
Two sides of the same coin, but totally different engravings.
Yeah.
And just when you think things couldn't get any tenser, bam, you've got the Czechoslovak coup.
February 1948, a democratically elected government overthrown. And guess who's back in the communists who did it?
I have a feeling I know the answer.
Yep, the Soviets. Talk about a wake-up call for the West.
Yeah, this isn't just Stalin being opportunistic anymore, right? This is a calculated move. Like, okay, he's playing for keeps. How did the West even respond to something that audacious?
Well, for one, Congress, they finally approved the Marshall Plan. Talk about a sense of urgency, right? But more than that, it solidified their resolve to contain Soviet influence, whatever it took. And that brings us to one of the most iconic standoffs of the whole entire Cold War.
Wait, are we about to talk about Berlin? Because, oh boy, things are about to get really interesting. All right, Berlin, a city divided, stuck right in the middle of a continent that's decided it can't stand to be on the same side anymore. Tensions were already running high, but then things really blew up.
Now, you're talking about the Berlin Blockade 1948.
Yeah.
See, after the war, Germany itself was chopped up into these occupation zones. The Soviets, they had the East, and the Western Allies were in the West. And Berlin, well, even though it was smack dab in the middle of the Soviet sector, they divided that up too.
So it's like a mini Germany inside Germany, each half mirroring that bigger ideological tug-of-war going on. What could possibly go wrong?
Right. And Stalin, being Stalin, he saw an opportunity to poke the bear a bit, see how tough the West really was. So what does he do? He cuts off all land access to West Berlin. No roads, no trains, no supplies. Just, boom, a city held hostage, hoping the Allies would just throw up their hands and walk away.
And we're talking millions of people, right? Just completely isolated, surrounded by Soviet-controlled territory. I'd be freaking out. What did the West do? Surely they weren't just going to abandon all those people.
You'd think not, right?
Yeah.
What they did was unbelievable, really. The Berlin Airlift. It was this insane feat of logistics, like nothing anyone had ever seen. Picture this. For over a year, planes were landing in West Berlin, like every minute, bringing everything: food, fuel, medicine. They even airlifted Christmas presents for the kids.
Hold on, they airlifted Christmas presents? That's both heartwarming and kind of tragic at the same time. But this whole Operation Vittles, as they called it, it actually worked.
It did. The Soviets, they tried to interfere, but they never actually shot down a plane.
Yeah.
We wouldn't want to start an actual war, right?
Yep.
So it's this bizarre situation, blockade on the ground, lifeline in the sky. And the people of West Berlin, they hung in there, thanks to those constant deliveries.
Talk about resilience, huh? But this whole thing, it had to have ramifications way beyond Berlin.
Oh, absolutely. First off, the blockade, it solidified the division of Germany.
Yeah.
In 1949, East and West Germany became official, two separate countries.
Yeah.
The very nation that was the heart of Nazi Germany, now the epicenter of the Cold War.
It's like out of the ashes of one conflict, another one rises. Kind of a grim poetry to it, you know? But there's more, isn't there? The Berlin Airlift, it sent a message.
It sure did. It showed the world that the West was serious about this whole containment thing, about stopping communism from spreading. The U.S. and their allies, they drew a line in the sand. They were willing to go to extraordinary lengths, put it all on the line to defend what they believed in.
It's amazing to think that something as basic as delivering supplies could have such a huge impact.
It's not just the act itself, it's what it symbolizes. And speaking of symbolic, the Berlin Blockade, it had a direct effect on the creation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which had actually been in the works already.
Wait, so that an attack on one is an attack on all alliance that came out of the whole Berlin standoff?
You could say the blockade was the kick in the pants it needed.
Yeah.
The West realized, okay, we need to present a united front, show that we're serious, because who knows what Stalin's going to pull next. NATO was the answer. Of course, the Soviets, they weren't just going to sit back and watch.
Cue the Warsaw Pact.
Bingo. 1955, not even a decade after we're celebrating the end of World War II, and now you've got two armed camps staring each other down. Europe, officially divided. Suspicion and ideology on both sides, and enough firepower to destroy the world 10 times over. It's kind of mind-blowing how quickly things spiraled.
And on that cheery note, it really makes you think, though, doesn't it? Even after all that devastation, all that loss, peace is this fragile thing.
It is. And sometimes, the things that lead to the next conflict, they start brewing, even as we're still cleaning up from the last one. So we've got these military alliances locked and loaded. The stage is set for, well, for what exactly? What's the next chapter in this Cold War saga?
Yeah.
Well, what comes next is a standoff. Decades, practically. These two superpowers, both with enough nukes to wipe out the planet, both convinced the other ones about to push the button. And it wasn't just about armies and weapons, right? It was about ideas.
Right, like a global chess match, but instead of pawns and rooks, you've got propaganda, you've got spies, you've got these proxy wars flaring up all over the place. But to really get that, you got to get the players, don't you? The guys calling the shots, their personalities, what they'd lived through, that all plays into it.
Totally. Take Stalin, right? This is a guy shaped by some serious brutality. The Russian Civil War, the Nazis rolling through his country. I mean, talk about trauma. He saw threats everywhere. Believed the West was out to get him, out to get the Soviet Union, period.
So paranoia, a healthy dose of ambition, all mixed up together. No wonder he ran things like, well, like a dictator.
Exactly. Fear and control. Those were his go-to moves. Now, flip the script to Truman. He becomes president right as World War II is wrapping up. Can you imagine stepping into that role at that moment?
Talk about pressure.
Right. He's got to fill Roosevelt's shoes. And unlike Roosevelt, who had at least spent some time, figuring out Stalin, Truman comes in way more suspicious, way more hawkish.
So while Stalin's busy building his little empire over there in the East, Truman's main thing is making sure it doesn't get any bigger.
Bingo. Containment. That was the name of the game for the U.S. The line was drawn this far, no further. And at the core of it all, you've got this clash of ideologies. Capitalism versus communism, finding a middle ground. Forget about it.
It's like they're speaking different languages, even when they're using the same words. No wonder everything felt so immediate, so high stakes.
And because they can't find that common ground, what do? They dig in. More weapons, more alliances, more suspicion. Every time one side does something, it just proves the other side's worst fears.
A vicious cycle, right? Like one of those things where you look back and it seems so obvious, so obvious how dangerous it was getting. Do any of these historians you're reading offer up solutions, or is it mostly just hindsight being 2020?
It's like most of history. There's no easy answer and a whole lot of opinions. Some of them, they put the blame squarely on Stalin. They say, look, the guy was power-hungry, expansionist. The West had to push back.
Makes sense, especially with how he was operating in Eastern Europe. But there's always another side, right?
Always. Others argue that the U.S., they have their own agenda. Economic interests, for sure, and that deep fear of communism. So they played a part in ratcheting up the tension. They say things like the Marshall Plan, yeah, it was sold as aid, but it was also about making sure America had its hooks in everything.
So it's not as cut and dried as either side wanted to believe back then?
Exactly. And that's what makes studying this stuff so fascinating. It's rarely about good guys and bad guys, but about interests and miscalculations and those very human mistakes that even the guys with all the power, they make them too.
And boy, can those mistakes have global consequences. It's kind of unsettling, when you look around at the world today. We might not be in Cold War 2.0 or anything, but you see echoes, those big power struggles, countries scrambling to team up, this constant sense that nobody trusts anybody. It makes you wonder, did we learn anything? Did any of it stick?
The million-dollar question, right. And I think that's why we dig into history, why we try to make sense of it all, even the parts that are just messy and complicated. Because if we can understand what led to something like the Cold War, those missteps, those moments where things could have gone a different way, maybe, just maybe, we can do better this time around.
Right, like avoiding the same potholes because we finally got a good look at the road. It's a lot to think about, but isn't that kind of the point? And speaking of thinking, as we lower the curtain on today's deep dive, I've got one last one for you. We've talked about all these different ways of seeing the Cold War, the different interpretations historians have. But what if we're living through something just as big right now, and we just don't realize it yet? What's going to be in the history books 100 years from now? What'll they point to and say, yep, that's where it all changed? It's a question worth pondering, don't you think? Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time for more adventures in history.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.